See that? Is it a little blurry? Good enough? Okay. All right. No, I have it work. Turn the lights off. Okay. Just before we go there, all right, we're going to look at a lot of chronology today. So we've got a lot of dates. Dates are good. I like to have you try to memorize dates because it allows you to put things in a little bit more sequence and try to, allows you a little bit more context. So I'm going to give you a quick and dirty overview of the very difficult 17th century in England, all right? And more than likely, if you're a history major, this is not anything new, right? But if you're not a history major, then it's not that clear. But we need to keep this in mind for understanding what's going on along the Atlantic seaboard. So the first thing, we'll start, of course, in 1625, Jamestown's already established. There's been a dreadful uprising of the Powhatan Indians in 1622, March 22nd, 1622. The Powhatan Confederacy launched a raid against many dozen of the settlements in the James River Valley in Virginia. And of the 1,240 colonists, the Powhatans killed, I think, 347 of them and wounded a lot of the other ones, and seriously hindered them. That's 1622. All right. Now in 1622, of course, the Pilgrims, who maybe we should better call the Separatists, had landed at Plymouth. They had attempted to come to Virginia, right? That was their original plan. They wound up getting blown off course, getting confused around Cape Cod, swirling into Cape Cod. Then they realized that they had to make landfall. They made landfall at Plymouth Rock. They established themselves. They were really saved by the local Wampanoags and local Indians for the first season or two. And anyway, so the 1620s are when everything is just sort of just getting started in New England. We're going to talk about New England today. Things are sort of crazy and very uncertain in Virginia. It's just brutal, and the idea of going to Virginia, if you had any information back in England, must have been close to a death sentence, because chances were you were going to die of a disease, of malaria, if you weren't going to starve to death, and if you weren't going to be killed by Indians. And after 1622, it was really, really dreadful, a dreadful place. So what in the world were people thinking, right? What drove them to Virginia? What drove them to New England? All right, to understand that, we have to go back into the context of, really we should be going back further than this, but at this point from your readings that the Church of England had really marginalized a lot of these dissenters, a lot of these Calvinists, these people who had been influenced by new European ideas of Protestantism that are coming out of the later part of the Reformation. And so the Puritan group, the Puritans wanted to get rid of the corruption of this large centralized body. They wanted to change society. They wanted to somehow reform society, but they were consistently persecuted for it. Where did they find refuge initially? They found refuge in Holland, in the Netherlands. So They moved to the Netherlands, and a lot of them were doing okay in the Netherlands, but they wanted to remain English. They wanted to get back to England someday. But eventually they found that there was an out. There was an option, and that option was to go to the New World. So, but let's look at what's going on in England during this time that we're going to talk about the colonization of the Atlantic seaboard, which is for the most part through the 17th century. And this is sort of the sequence of events back in the homeland, back in the mother country. In 1625, Charles I ascends to the throne. Charles I, what do you know about him? Charles I was, what religious persuasion was he? He was, I think, nominally Anglican, but when he died, he was a Catholic. Okay, so Charles I reigned from 1625 to 1649. He's known for not getting along with Parliament at all, and this is really the initial thing that begins to really embroil so many Puritans and other Englishmen who have been used to a tradition of some semblance of democracy that was developing. And what happened was Charles I essentially recognized this divine right of kings and used his full authority to push toward more of an absolute monarchy. And that absolute monarchy was, beginning to ignore the people, the representatives in Parliament. And so Charles I begins to push and push, and eventually, by 1642, the first English Civil Wars, first of the three English Civil Wars. You can say the English Civil War from about 1642 to 51, but there are actually three different stages, three different wars. But the 1642 is when the wars break out. Eventually, Charles I is captured and executed. And this is one of the more pivotal events in English history, is the execution of a king. There's actually a term for it, the regicide, right? Regicide, the killing of a king, the execution of a king. Why did they, who did it and why did they do it? Well, the parliamentarians, the Roundheads under Oliver Cromwell, even though Cromwell was not even party to the execution, the opposite side of the king intended to cut off the monarchy, to end the monarchy. So the only way you could do that is kill the king. And this was really a tragedy. A lot of historians look back on this, and think of Charles I in some ways as a martyr, because he was symbolic of the monarchy, but he refused to give up the throne. So they executed him, and that begins what is referred to generally as the Commonwealth period. And that English Commonwealth only lasted for a few years, 4 years, until it was transformed into what's referred to as the Protectorate under Oliver Cromwell. Oliver Cromwell was declared the protector, in some ways kind of a military dictator, kind of, and I'm not a historian, so, but I'm probably infuriating my colleagues in history in some ways. So, but he was in many ways a military ruler for a good 5 years, 1653 to 1658. So I'm just trying to give you some context. We don't have to give it, this is not an interpretation of this, but So you have the Roundheads in control, Parliament in control. The name of the English government at this time goes by different things. I've seen it referred to as the Commonwealth, or the Protectorate, or the Republic. Okay, so that's where that it's no longer a monarchy. So England goes to this period from about 1649 to about 1660, 1659 without a king, without a monarch. Okay. Now, during that time, Charles I's son, Charles II, was exiled. Okay. Where was he exiled to? Who is the ally of the Catholic kings from
Spain?
the House of Stuart? Yeah.
Spain?
Spain and
France.
France. Okay. So he's exiled to France. Charles II is exiled to France, where he marries the Queen. Now, Charles II was would eventually return after the fall of the Protectorate, the decline of the Protectorate, the fizzling of the Protectorate. And when did that happen? That happened when Cromwell died. Cromwell died of natural causes. Some people think he was poisoned, but probably died of kidney problem. But anyway, Cromwell's reign ended, and the Restoration began. So the English Restoration, right? Maybe I got that on tape. The Restoration was this period when the monarchy was reestablished. Completely eliminating the monarchy was difficult on most English. So Charles II comes back. Now, Charles II is Catholic, right? But Charles II is also a very popular king. This is not a bad time for England in terms of its economy. Its economy is actually beginning to grow. And so, and I think I've actually mentioned that. When Charles II takes the throne and the Restoration occurs, the forces that had divided England for so long were largely drawn back together, and England's economy recovers, which means that there were fewer people really wanting to go to the New World. There weren't the push factors that had been around for a while. And we talk about push factors and pull factors in migration and geography. A pull factor is an attraction of the place. That's a good reason to migrate, a good reason to go to a new place because there's opportunity there, there's freedom there. The push factors are the awful things that are forcing you out of your home, and those are usually very, very difficult to force people out of their homelands. And so there are a lot of horrible things going on politically before the Civil War. So those folks who were marginalized by the Roman Catholic Church and the Anglican Church, but particularly the Calvinists, they were marginalized. They were the ones who were seeking refuge in Holland and then in America. Then we have the period when the Roundheads, Parliamentarians take over, right in the middle of the century. And that's a brief respite for those Puritans and for others. So we've got an important, I want you to recognize that there are really strong political push factors going on until about, until the mid-1600s. And so beginning with the execution of Charles I, what group is probably being persecuted in England now?
Catholics.
The Catholics, exactly. Now keep that in mind because that's really important. the Catholics are under pressure now. Okay, and then with the Restoration, people are starting to get along a little bit more. However, the Restoration wouldn't have happened had it not been for Charles II having political connections. And Charles II went into debt. And Charles II, even though he was a popular king, he didn't actually have a successor for a long time. He didn't have a son with his wife, but he had a lot of children with a lot of other women. Okay, and he had nicknames for that, but he had lots of concubines. And but the thing about Charles II was he didn't have. It was known that he did not have a successor. His wife was barren, supposedly. And so the thinking was that who would be the righteous successor to the throne once Charles II was gone. Who was it? It was his sister Mary. His sister Mary, who wasn't Catholic, who was Protestant. His sister Mary had taken asylum in Holland. Okay? So, we've got, and she was married to an aristocrat, a Dutch aristocrat by the name of William of Orange. Okay? Now, William of Orange and Mary II were living in Holland. Charles II is not doing so great. He, in 1681, sorry, I had my notes and left my notes on my office desk, okay? This is terrible, it happens. So, quick look at Wikipedia before class. So now I've got my dates, I think. But correct me if I'm wrong. 1681, Charles II, not getting along with Parliament now, dissolves Parliament. Dissolves it. And here we go back. Here we go back to something close to, moving toward absolute rule. So, kind of like, imagine the President of the United States dissolving Congress, saying, "Go home, don't worry about it. I'm going to take care of everything myself now." Okay?
Well, that's what Boris Johnson just did, right?
Well, yeah, all right. So they're not a compound republic. They're not a federal system. So, we have safeguards against. Hopefully, we have the king dissolving Parliament, not the Prime Minister. The king dissolving Parliament unleashes a lot of real anxiety among the people who are expecting Mary to eventually take the throne. And Mary, of course, being a Protestant, that would have unified, supposedly unified thing. But now it looked like Charles II was going to become more of an absolute monarch like his father. And by dissolving Parliament, it was kind of waiting him out. And then what happened? Then Charles II's wife has a baby. Okay? So that means that the successor would be another Catholic. Not just another Catholic, but Charles II would more than likely reign and become, his son would begin a new Catholic dynasty in England. And so that's when things really changed, or at least it looked like another civil war, right? But this is what happened. At the same time that this is all going on, England and the Dutch have been rivals throughout the 17th century. Rivals for world trade. And England was behind. England was really not as efficient or as astute as the Dutch. So this unification, or this idea that Mary might potentially take the throne, and with some help from the Dutch, that gave the Dutch and the Protestants in England and the Protestants in America a very strong incentive to join forces. Okay, so we've got again what happens, and of course the story is well known. So what happens is that Charles II is becoming another absolute monarch, but the Dutch put together the world's largest flotilla, invasion force the world has ever seen. Except instead of the D-Day invasion, it's from England to the continent. It's the continent to England, and so this Dutch flotilla moves about something like 40,000 Dutch troops, but they were a whole bunch. The Dutch don't have a lot of people, so they actually hire out most of their folks. There are a lot of mercenaries. There are a lot of people from all over. A lot of Germans, working for the Dutch, and even some Irish and so forth. Even some Catholics who were going to go fight. So anyway, they invade in 1688, and it's a very they call it the Protestants refer to it as a bloodless revolution. But there were a few people that were killed, something like 15 or something. But for the most part, what happened was the William of Orange and Mary, with this force of Dutch, arrive in England slowly. It's sort of like a slow invasion. And why would they do that? You sound like a historian. Sorry, I don't mean to go there, but the reason they did it was because they realized that Charles II didn't have as much. He didn't have as much support as they had. So the popular will of the people was that Mary would be put into the throne. So what happens is they put out an order to capture, or Charles II, of course, takes his army and marches down to the coast, but his generals start to book. His generals start to trade sides. And once that happens, he loses his army. The English army is not going to go fight a bunch of Englishmen in southern England. And so the so-called glorious revolution, or bloodless revolution, takes place in the late part of 1688. About this time of year is when they got started, but they didn't make the invasion until November. 1688. By 1689, Charles II is fleeing, trying to find his way out of England. And eventually what happens is they actually captured, they know where he is. They could have captured him and killed him, but instead what they did was they allowed him to escape to France. And William and Mary then they take the throne as joint monarchs. So this is the period of William and Mary, okay? You've probably heard of William and Mary. So the Glorious Revolution, and the key part of the Glorious Revolution, I think I perhaps mentioned it before, is that it established, and really it got started here with the Roundheads, right? The attempt by Parliament to put some checks on the monarch, okay? They attempted to do that, but of course Charles II blew it. Charles II was the one who ended that hope after the Civil War was over. But the invasion and the revolution of 1688, probably one of the most important events, certainly in English history, certainly in the history of the English-speaking realm of the world, but really also to democracy. And it laid the foundation for the United States independence movement and the American Revolution. What was the most important document established in 1689 after this revolution? The Magna
No, that was
Carta was a
earlier.
lot earlier, but you're on the right track. You're on the right track. In fact, it's referring back to the Magna Carta, okay? The English Bill of Rights, very important document. Now, the Constitution of England, the British Constitution, or the English Constitution, is a tradition, including the Magna Carta, okay? What they refer to as the Constitution is not a single document like ours. Their Constitution is a set of documents and traditions in common law and so forth. But the English Bill of Rights is about the closest thing other than the Magna Carta to something that is a single document that's very important. And what it does is it recognizes individual rights. It recognizes the right of Parliament to supersede the monarch. And so basically the monarch after 1688 is no longer capable of reaching absolute power, okay? The monarch is put in its place, the monarchy is put in its place. It's still important, but it is a sovereign. Still the sovereign, but the monarchy is no longer capable of eliminating Parliament. Okay? Parliament is supreme. That's very important for this class and others. But anyway, so 1688, 1689, English Bill of Rights. And the English Bill of Rights is that it's a check on government. Okay? All right, so that's enough of that. But keep the dates in mind, and let's look at some of these dates now. So we have, and I've saved this because to me it's helpful. And some of the smaller points on here, I really need to type this up so you can, it's a little bit more legible. But so this is what I call the order of implantation or implantment on the Atlantic seaboard during the 1600s. And these are this doesn't include some of the more minor colonies, like New Hampshire. I don't think I have anything about New Hampshire on here, but I'll explain why. 1607, we know Jamestown, right? 1607. In 1608, there were a couple of other very important implantations that we've covered already. Can you think of them? 1608 in Canada. Montreal, establishing the very first, sort of beachhead along the St. Lawrence River. In 1608 in New Spain. That's a pretty easy one. 1608 is the founding of Santa Fe. Okay, so basically the establishment of the Spanish in New Mexico. So 1607, 1608, okay, so things are happening. 1614 is the initial date of the Hudson Valley colonization by the Dutch. So recall that there were, there's the Virginia Company of London and the Virginia Company of Plymouth. They have royal claim to the seaboard, but of course, there's no way that they can occupy all of it. So in that area between them where there's sort of a conflicting zone or it's not really sure, the Dutch swing in. And we've talked about the Dutch getting involved in the fur trade along the Hudson River. Fort Nassau is located south of present-day Albany on the river. They were trading with the Iroquois, recall that. 1620, the Plymouth colony is established. That's the Separatists or the Pilgrims. That's located on the mainland north of Cape Cod. And that was an actual colony. A lot of times we think of Plymouth as a town, which it was, but Plymouth was actually a separate colony. I'll try to post a map so you can see it, but that colony lasted for about 70 years, from 1620 to 1691. There's the date, if you can see that. And then after 1691, it was merged with Massachusetts. Now, during the reign of Charles II, the New England colonies, now who's occupying the New England colonies for the most part? Plymouth and in Massachusetts Bay, and the offshoots of the Puritans in Massachusetts Bay, which would be several places in Connecticut, mostly like New Haven, and of course Providence, Rhode Island, Roger Williams. Okay, so there are expanding Puritan settlements in Massachusetts Bay, but then there are also and there are other sort of colonies of Massachusetts Bay that go down into what is today Connecticut. So they don't really, they have just claim over relatively small areas. And there are some dissidents like Williams, okay, at Providence. So there are these splinters of Puritans and these New Englanders, but they're also moving up the coast, up to New Hampshire, eventually up the coast of Maine, and Massachusetts would of course claim all that. So what happens is these colonies are all acting fairly independently, governing themselves, and Charles II issues by one way that he could kind of consolidate their influence or sort of minimize their influence is by consolidating the colonies. And so he declared this Commonwealth of New England. And that really upset a lot of people because they didn't act as one unit. They were individual settlements, and they had been, in many cases, chartered. So what the king did was he rescinded all of their charters and basically wrapped them all up in, and he's acting from across the Atlantic as if it's going to have much relevance. But essentially all he was doing was taking away some of their natural liberties that they had grown to appreciate and enjoy. So anyway, that was sort of some political stuff that took place in the 1680s. But after Charles II is gone, then things would develop a little bit better. So Massachusetts Bay Colony was established in 1629, and this is the most significant colony in New England in terms of numbers. By 1640s, you've got 21,000 people, and these are Puritans for the most part, but they're what we might call sort of the moderate Puritans. They're not like the separatists so much. They elect a governor known by the name of John Winthrop. He serves for a very long period of time, so it's a very stable society during this early day development. So we have this, and when I say moderate Puritans, what I mean there is that they were coming for religious freedom, but who were the Puritans? The Puritans were mostly people who had lived in cities. They were mostly urbanites. They are often referred to as people coming from the southeastern part of England, East Anglia, the East Midlands area, Lincoln, etc. But they actually came from a lot of places. A lot of them came from London. And they had, of course, been traveling. They had been moving around to a degree. They had lived in Antwerp or lived in Amsterdam. But anyway, they were fairly skilled people. They were very well educated compared to most other English. They tended to be very well educated, pretty highly skilled, not necessarily farmers. Okay, they were generally not skilled as farmers. So that was a downfall. That was a problem. You probably know that. You've read about it. Now, what I'm trying to get to here with the English colonies is that these little symbols here, the asterisk or Union Jack or whatever that might be, is my little symbol for the what you've seen in the readings as investor, let's see, what are they called? Well, I refer to them as company ventures, they're private ventures. So they're stockholders, so stockholding companies, right? So people are actually investing in the possibilities that these colonies might wind up making a profit. There was also a lottery that was funding them. And anyway, the ventures at Jamestown in Virginia, as well as Massachusetts Bay, those were both private company ventures. We've talked about the Virginia Company of London. Now, in 1624, what happens? 1624, the failure, what was becoming obvious as a failure on the Chesapeake, prompted, in 1622, remember the massacre? In 1624, the king, who's the king at the time? Charles I, right? Charles I, a Catholic, right? Takes the charter and makes Virginia a royal colony. Well, Anglican. He's really an Anglican, I guess. So Virginia is a royal colony under Anglican rule, and that meant who's going to be getting the land grants? Who's going to be getting these? Who's going to be getting land from the king? The Anglicans, all right? So and for the most part, the loyalists, the Anglican loyalists, are the ones who eventually wind up becoming established in Virginia, okay? So, there's connections between the migration streams and the political nature, the political situation in England. That's all I really want to get through here. Now, what happens to him? when do they kill him? Or 1642 is when the Civil War breaks out, and by this time, I've talked a little bit about France and how the Huguenots were persecuted as Protestants, but in England, you've got a majority of Anglicans and Calvinists and a minority of Catholics. And so the Catholics are persecuted. And this also plays into what's going on in Ulster Colony in Northern Ireland. So there's this Protestant Catholic dynamic going on in England, and those English Catholics then are looking for a place to settle. So we have the establishment in 1634 by a family known as the Calverts, Cecilius Calvert and George Calvert, who have a title, a peer title known as Lord Baltimore. Lord Baltimore, well, that's easy to remember, Baltimore, Maryland, right? That's where that comes from. Lord Baltimore was proprietor, okay? Notice the pound symbol, or my awful rendition of the pound symbol. This indicates a proprietary colony. Proprietary colonies are administered generally, essentially they are the operations of one man or one man's company. So these colonies, Maryland, Pennsylvania, okay, are two primary proprietary colonies that are established. They're not the only ones, but they're the most important ones here. So proprietary colonies beginning with Maryland, and think about that for a second, okay? Maryland is named for this Catholic queen, and anyway, so anyway, it's established as a haven for English Catholics. Now, this is very important. The English Catholics had their own title system, their own peerage system, kind of a minor peerage system. And these were mostly people who were of the landowning classes in England. They were given land with the intention that, if they left England, and these were the English well-to-do people who had a lot of influence. If they would leave and go to the New World, they could get even more land. If they sent their second sons, who weren't inheriting that much to Maryland, they could establish themselves. So they were given these large land grants in Maryland. Now, there was one issue, and that is that the Catholics did not, they initially came to Maryland intending to settle with and reestablish the old baronic system, or essentially the feudal system in Maryland. They also had big plans. They had big plans to establish towns. And those towns would be located, those towns would have artisan workers. They would be colonized by people with lots of skills. This was the idea in Maryland. Okay? Lots of skills. And so Maryland was initially planned out with these great expectations. But the most important one was that these English aristocrats from England, English aristocrats would be given a land base for their families. And those folks would continue to pass land on down. So it was an attempt to establish the aristocracy in America. Okay? Now, they did not want to farm tobacco, as was getting started in Virginia to the south. So between this time from the 1630s through the English Civil War, right, what do you think is happening in Maryland? The Catholic families get established in Maryland, but then what happens during the English Civil War? The Catholics are in control, but most of the labor is not Catholic. And so in Maryland, you have this uprising of Protestants against the Catholic landowners during the English Civil Wars. You haven't read about that, but anyway, that's happening north of Virginia. Eventually, what would happen to Maryland? Well, eventually the planned ideas for an English aristocracy and the planned ideas for settled towns with artisan populations never came to fruition. What did happen was those English landowners who wanted to make some money realized that about the only way they could do it was by growing tobacco. They also wanted to keep Maryland a free soil colony. Later on in the 1600s, by the 1680s is when Virginia is beginning to import black slaves, African slaves, Caribbean slaves. 1680s. By the 1690s, they're really bringing in lots of African slaves from the Caribbean, Sugar Islands, and so forth, as well as directly from Africa. And Maryland realizes that if they don't get in on this, okay, then they're just, so what happens is morals get trumped by economic incentive. And we have the expansion of slavery and tobacco within Maryland. So it was one of these colonies that started off with great intentions and high expectations, and and it didn't work. It didn't work out. We've talked a little bit about Sweden, New Sweden. They were a very, very small population established at basically a trading post known as Fort Christina, basically the present day site of, what is it? I want to say Newark, but it's not. Newark, Delaware, not New York, New Jersey, but Newark, Delaware. Anyway, forget that. So anyway, we have New Sweden getting established on the Delaware River. We've talked about the Finns who they brought in. I haven't even discussed the thing that interests me the most, and that is, maybe I'll show this to you in a little bit, but I have this photograph of these Puritans in Plymouth, and it's a rendition from probably the 1920s or something of the Puritans having the Pilgrims having their first Thanksgiving, like 1622 or something. And well, I'll post it for you, okay? But it's a picture of log cabins, okay? The Puritans, did they build log cabins? No, they didn't. They had no idea about building in logs. Log construction that's so American was introduced by these Scandinavians in the Delaware Valley and would be emulated and copied by Germans and Scotch-Irish moving into the same area in the early part of the 1700s. So we'll talk about that when we get into the 1700s. All right, and I just got to mention a few things about the other proprietary settlement, Pennsylvania. We'll talk a lot more about it later, but Pennsylvania is just getting started in the 1680s. Of course, William Penn, as you recall, William Penn was a Roundhead fighting in the English Civil War, right? And then he becomes a Quaker. We know that story. He becomes a pacifist. And he wants to create a refuge. Okay, well, wait a minute. Where did he get all this land?
It was owed to him by the king.
Which king? In 1681. In the 1680s, who's the king?
Charles II?
Charles II. Now think about that. William Penn, who did he owe who did Charles II owe the debt to?
The son?
William Penn's father.
Yeah.
Okay? William Penn's father. Now think about that one. If William Penn's father had loaned Charles II a large amount of cash so that he can consolidate his control and, get away with the restoration, Charles II, and for the most part France, was apparently paying off a lot of the opposition. Okay, and we've always said great things about William Penn. I don't know enough about him, but apparently Charles II had a huge debt, and maybe it was a political debt. Maybe that's all it was a something that William Penn's father had done to, to not oppose the king. Okay, perhaps that's what it was. Nevertheless, Charles II was trying to settle debts, and of course, one thing he could do to get rid of all those Quakers is to give William Penn this huge proprietary holding in Pennsylvania, and there goes a lot of your problem, right? Get rid of those Protestants, and Quakers particularly, who are going to be opposing you politically. So Pennsylvania is a refuge for Quakers, and it would be more significant as a magnet for non-English speaking migrants, really beginning after 1700. So we're going to reserve Pennsylvania and talk a little bit more about that. Now, Philadelphia does get established, and Philadelphia is a pretty interesting place. We'll talk about it later. But it really deserves an entire lecture, and I don't have one yet before the exam. Okay, another one, 1635, not very long at all after Plymouth and after Massachusetts Bay Colony, right? Really, Connecticut and Long Island, even though we think of Connecticut as its own state today, its own colony, it was actually a number of different smaller colonies along the Connecticut Valley and along the coast, which is referred to as the New Haven shore. So several small colonies that were known generically as Connecticut, essentially because of the Connecticut River Valley. But these were areas that were, for the most part, offshoots or later colonies from Massachusetts Bay. Long Island, particularly the eastern half of Long Island, is really colonized by these Puritans. And then we've talked a little bit about Rhode Island, Providence, Roger Williams, establishing these. They were dissenters from the Puritans, but they got established in 1636 at Narragansett Bay, which is a large area. Now, the examples of the two with stars, Connecticut and Narragansett Bay, are offshoots of Massachusetts Bay, chartered as corporations, but your readings refers to them as another type, and that is a covenant colony, okay? So we have really, and I should maybe redo this, but we have joint stock companies, joint stock colonies, okay? We have proprietary colonies, that's the king gives you a lot of land and then you do with it as you please. And we have covenant colonies. These are basically started after colonization. They're sort of really independent, okay? All right, we talked a little bit about Charlestown and how it was a colony of Barbados. Very different, even though they're all English, very different in terms of their economy and their ties to the Caribbean. So, there's no problem here with religious dissidents that you, oh, I take that back. There is. Charlestown is very much a plantation economy, but it does and has for a long time attracted Protestant dissenters from France, the Huguenots. The Huguenots go way back in South Carolina, but there's a strong contingent of Huguenots in Charlestown, and there's another very strong contingent of Huguenots in the Chesapeake, particularly around the southern part of where the boundary of Virginia and North Carolina are located, Albemarle Sound, okay? Albemarle Sound is kind of a magnet for Huguenots, okay? That area. All right, any questions over the sequencing and the dates? I'll post this, so you'll see it. Okay. All right. Now, in the time that we have left, which is not a lot, let's have a look at some maps and some photos. And here we're going to talk about specifically about New England, just a few things. Oh, well, that's not New England, is it? What is this? New Netherlands, okay? So look at this. We have or New Belgium, I guess, New Belgium. So we have a Dutch map. Isn't that great? The Dutch map showing the yellow areas, right? The yellow areas is the area that's claimed by Holland, by the Netherlands. What's wrong with that map? Well, it's been made by a Dutchman, that's why. So this kind of shows the claims, okay? The claims to the land, as well as turkeys and stuff like that. That's kind of cool. Okay, deer. Europeans were interested in beaver, okay? Otter. So fur trade. Yeah, this is supposed to be the Hudson Valley right here. Okay? See the Hudson Valley? And then what would this river be? This would be the Mohawk River, okay? Now you see this Hudson Valley, that's obvious. So here's another river, what's that?
Delaware.
You can cheat and look at your phone if you want. I'm gonna try to not kill myself or injure you and adjust this because it's just not in focus. Okay. Tell me when that's in focus. I guess that's as good as it gets. Ah, well, I'm spoiled by my retina display. That's the problem. Okay, So we've got this river valley. What is that? What state is this?
Connecticut?
Connecticut. That's the Connecticut River. Right, exactly. Now, what would this be? Okay, so the Dutch were not so great at cartography, right? Well, you see this. What was that? Cape Cod, right? Cape Cod and Nantucket and Martha's Vineyard, okay? And the Maine coast, what would this be? This is Cape Ann right here. If you look at it on the map today, it's hardly even noticeable, but it was an important location for the English. So what is the red? What does the red indicate?
British?
Yes, English. Okay, these are the English holdings. The English have control of New England, obviously, and they also have control of Long Island. Look at that. And what about these green things? What are those?
French, maybe?
Swedes.
Well, I think maybe the key is this right here.
Oh, Swedish?
Yeah, the Swedish. This is New Sweden. Now, remember, the Dutch are kind of just tolerating the Swedes. What would this be? What bay? This is Delaware Bay, okay? And this is the Delaware River, right? Okay, so the Delaware River, wow, the Dutch are claiming the Delaware River? What is the deal here? And I can't see the date of the map. But anyway, it's an interesting map, isn't it? And of course down here is, what would this be?
That'd be the other half of the English colonies, right?
Yeah, this is the Chesapeake Bay right here. That's the idea. And this would be Maryland or something. So there's a lot of confusion going on early on. Here's an older, or probably newer map. As you can see, obviously, Cape Cod, the settlements along the coast, the idea of the Great Lakes, mountainous areas, really not familiar here at all. What would this be? What do we call this today? Starts with an N, Narragansett Bay. So this is the Narragansett lowlands. This is Rhode Island today. This is Connecticut, Massachusetts. All right, now getting a little farther south and a little better geographic information by this time. This is probably mid-1600s. We've got the coast tacked out really well, so the Chesapeake begins to take good form. And look at this, back in the back country. So here's Delaware Bay, right? Chesapeake Bay, the Hudson Valley, the Connecticut Valley, Cape Cod, Long Island, and the Outer Banks. You see the Outer Banks here? North Carolina. Look at this. Look at all the settlements. This would be Charleston down here, Charlestown. And then you have some settlements along the coast of North Carolina now, with this being, this would be Albemarle Sound, or actually, I think this would be Albemarle Sound and Pamlico Bay down here. So they are beginning to have some settlements here. Now what I wanted to say is that by 1700, by the late 1600s, this area is getting settled, but it's mostly the movement of people south from the Chesapeake. So this area winds up influencing this area, okay? And this would later become what? North Carolina. But at this time, before 1700, there's no division between North and South Carolina. It's just all the Carolina coast. It's just kind of all disconnected, except for down here at the low country, down here around Charlestown. Charlestown, you can see it. So Charlestown in the low country is actually an area that's kind of an island off by itself from the rest of the colonies. Even though they have cultural connections and sort of similar attitudes, they're very Anglican here as well as Huguenot. And but again, they're mostly focused on the Caribbean, while the Chesapeake is going to be mostly focused on exporting to England. So this entire Carolina coast is separated largely by this midsection of North Carolina. And so you would have an expansion of people south to grow tobacco, and an expansion of people inland and to a degree south into what would become Georgia. This is essentially the location of Savannah, right here, but Oglethorpe hasn't done anything yet. This map precedes Georgia. Okay, let's go up to New England then, and obviously that's what? Plymouth Rock, okay? And this is kind of what it looks like a little bit. And some things to identify. This is a traditional New England style of architecture known as the salt box type of house. And I don't have time to really get into the architecture too much, but just some ideas. Again, here we have sort of the cultural hearth of New England. Just to give you some ideas and locations. We've talked about the Virginia companies and so forth, but you know, essentially these were initially private entrepreneurial attempts that failed miserably. So what happened is the king, Charles I, takes them over, makes them into royal settlements in it takes away the charter in 1624. There are some other examples here. There are some other failed colonies. One is known as St. George in southern Maine, which was abandoned in 1607. We don't hear a lot about that one. But you know, it's amazing that Jamestown even survived after its first few years. This is I think we've seen this map before, but this shows that zone where the two companies overlapped, and the rule was that they couldn't establish a colony between 100 miles of each other, so they stayed away from it. Here's a map of some of the Native American linguistic stocks of the area. All I really wanted to let you know is, all I really want you to get from this is differences for the most part, in culture groups in New England proper, and versus the Appalachian area. So in upstate New York, you've got the Iroquois, and my batteries are out. I wanted to point out, I think I mentioned the Tuscarora. Now you probably have heard of the Tuscarora. How many of you heard of the Tuscarora? Okay, they are an Iroquois. They're a member of the Iroquois Confederation. Today they are. And what happened was they were defeated by the Cherokees, who were also an Iroquois group. So they were at war with a lot in the Yamasees, I think. They were at war with different groups, and they wound up moving to the north. Okay, so the nations of the Iroquois are the Susquehanna, the Tuscarora, but also the Mohawk, the Onondaga, the Seneca, Cayuga, and I can't name them all, sorry, at the moment. So anyway, and then we have in the southeast, we have very large tribes, basically the Creek Confederacy in this area. The Cherokees are actually a number of different towns, different areas, and they're very powerful. But along the coast, we have the Powhatan, March 22nd, 1622, first major massacre of white settlers by Indians, and a very coordinated attack put by the Powhatan Confederacy. Up in New England, the Narragansetts were thinking about similar things, but they were diplomacy worked a little bit there in Providence. Okay, well, I've already talked a little bit about this. So I just want to cover some bases that we've seen before. The dark shade here, the purplish shade, blue, whatever that is just indicative of the sort of the frontier zone of settlement by 1700. So just keep that in mind. And what I'd like for you to notice is that the coast from Providence all the way up to Newport, and this is, Portsmouth right here. Portsmouth all the way up into Maine is colonized by 1700. A lot of these are fishing type villages and logging or getting timber for naval ships and that sort of thing. But look at the the disparities in terms of settlement. There's settlement up this river valley. What's that river valley? It goes right up through the sort of the west central part of Massachusetts. It's the Connecticut River Valley. So the Connecticut River Valley is about the only good agricultural area that there you can find in New England. And so that is a magnet of settlement by 1700. And look at what's happening to, you know, the Indians that are living in this area. They're getting surrounded by whites. So here you would, you would begin to see some Indian wars, well, definitely would, during the 1600s, but maybe a little bit better map. Here's a better map. So you have a Connecticut River Valley extension of settlement. This is by 1700, more or less. Same map, you know, basically the same distribution. But I wanted to point out that in Connecticut, you had these pretty scattered colonies. And then in 1691, they would consolidate. But the largest group, of course, is Massachusetts Bay. And of course, what city is here now? Boston, right? Now Plymouth is located way down here. And remember, Plymouth Colony is a separate colony from Massachusetts Bay Colony. And what would happen in Plymouth? Well, Plymouth wouldn't attract a lot of settlement initially. Massachusetts Bay did. And that's where most of these colonies were basically child colonies of these older colonies here. 5 minutes or so? Okay. I'll post these, but you can see some comparisons. I like to sort of, compare and contrast. I've talked a little bit about how Plymouth was not such a fast-growing colony, largely because it was pretty isolated from any good ports, and it remained fairly much a backwater compared to what's happening in Massachusetts Bay. Here you have rapid growth because of both immigration and natural increase. Families are moving into Massachusetts Bay. This is the first area of the Atlantic seaboard where we see family settlement. And of course, when you have family settlement, you're going to have natural increase faster than in Virginia or in South Carolina or elsewhere. But that would be the very first natural increase oriented settlement. And there are some common characteristics that you can look at, you can discuss. They had similar attitudes about the environment, about the wilderness. And a lot of writers have said, New England, this is the area where if English culture was successfully transplanted into the Atlantic seaboard, it was most transplanted here. But then there are some stereotypes that we need to get around. And first of all, the stereotype of the Puritan is one that we've been told for a long time. You've maybe read, what is it? What's that famous play? The Crucible, right? You've watched The Crucible, or you've read The Crucible or something, and so you've got an idea of these Puritans walking around all dour and never having any fun. But the Puritans were not like that. The Puritans were pretty had quite a bit of variation in their habits. They didn't all dress in black. In fact, they kind of liked color. They were, of course, nuclear families, and where the husband and father often had a lot more authority than maybe what you're used to. And they keep in mind that these are people who had been persecuted by larger established religion, and they wanted to establish something new. They wanted to have their own world, their own England, an England without all the corruption, without all of the bureaucracy. And in many ways, the signs showed them that God was with them. And of course, they viewed their whole experience as a trial, you know, as a part of the act of faith, right? Just being there and surviving in itself was an act of faith. So that's important, and you know that played into the behavior and the culture that developed in Massachusetts Bay. You know, like I said, a lot of these folks were not very skilled in agriculture, but they had other skills and were very quite well read. And we don't need to talk about the land survey system so much yet, but I would like for you to know that the expansion of those colonies, of those towns, was typically planned. And the way this would work in the Puritan era, before 1700, the Puritan era is when you would have, when a village would wind up getting crowded enough so that younger men wouldn't have very good access to very good land. What would happen was the congregation, the leading members of the families would get together and they would figure out a new location for a settlement, for a new town, and they would allow those individuals who were young and willing and ready to go out into the wilderness and establish a new town. They would do that all at one time together and establish a new settlement. So these settlements have real clear dates of founding, founded by families who were establishing new farms, and they often kept the same name, or they would just rename their place as, you know, West, whatever, or North, or Center, or something like that. So you see that phenomenon all over New England and throughout the northern part of the Midwestern United States, that tendency for people to name their new town after their old town. So just a interesting caveat of that type of settlement. And we'll look at the survey system, that sort of thing later, but I'll stop at this